Hello, this is Pastor Mark again with from Christ Covenant Church, producing another segment in our YouTube series on the nature of the gospel. And today, in this segment, I'm going to talk about what is typically described as God's unconditional love in the evangelical church. When we talk about God's love, many times God's love is described as totally unconditional. That is, there's nothing you can do nor need to do to please God, that now He loves His people, not based upon their performance, but based upon total unconditional acceptance. I think, biblically speaking, that is not an accurate teaching about what it means to remain in God's love or to be loved by God. Now, there is one sense, biblically, in which we can talk about God's unconditional love. It's important for us to make careful distinctions. There is a sense in which we can talk about God's unconditional love, and then another important sense in which we have to talk about God's conditional love. Biblically speaking, there is a sense in which we can say God loves us unconditionally from eternity past. And this would be God's love of election, or according to election or predestination. Now, I say this because of what Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1. Here we see Paul describing God's love from eternity past. Listen to his words from Ephesians chapter 1, beginning in verse 4. For He chose us in Him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in His sight. In love, He predestined us to be adopted as His sons through Jesus Christ, in accordance with His pleasure and will. So here is Paul describing this love which is before the creation of the world. In love, He predestined us to be adopted as His sons. Not according to our faith, not according to our works, according to Paul in verse 5, but according to His pleasure and will. So in this important sense, we can talk and must talk about God's unconditional love, according to election. But when we come to the covenant, when we come to covenantal words in John 15, in 1 Corinthians 15, in Hebrews 10, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, when we come to covenantal words, here we read about God's love, which is totally conditional. We're going to turn to some of those passages right now. In which we discover God's conditional love for us. And here we find Jesus describing this conditional love in John chapter 15. Listen to the words of Christ. He teaches the disciples here, John chapter 15, verse 9. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in His love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. So here is a totally conditional statement in which Jesus is describing and explaining to His disciples and to us as well how we are to remain in His love. He says, once again, if you obey my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commands and remain in His love. So here, love is being described as conditional. If we obey His commands, the commands of Christ, we will remain in the love of Christ. Now we find this as well with the Apostle Paul, when he describes the conditional nature of remaining in God's love in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Listen to the Apostle Paul. He says, Now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. Here again is a thoroughly conditional statement. That is, He's saying you will remain saved. By this gospel, you are saved if, conditional statement, if you hold firmly to the word I preach to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. So here Paul is saying, if you don't continue to believe what I've taught you, and you go away from it, then all of the believing that you've had up to this point is in vain. That's Paul's intent here. So here again is this conditional statement of how we're to remain in God or to remain in God's love. We find it again in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Here is Paul exhorting Timothy. And he says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, here is a trustworthy saying, if we died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Now here is once again, a totally conditional set of statements by the Apostle Paul describing this conditional love that God has for us. If we disown him, Paul says, he will also disown us. Then he goes on to say, if we are faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Now I've heard people say, here's a passage that is an example for God's unconditional love. And they take it this way. If we are faithless, he will remain faithful to still love us, even though we're faithless. But that can't be Paul's intent, because right before this he says, if we disown him, he will also disown us. So Paul would be contradictory to go on to say, if we are faithless, he will remain faithful and still love us, for he cannot disown himself. Clearly what Paul means here is, if we disown him, he will also disown us. If we are faithless, he will remain faithful, that is, faithful to himself, to his own glory. He will remain faithful to his promise to bless or curse, for he cannot disown himself. If we disown him, he will disown us, because he cannot disown himself. He will not continue aligned with us if we disown him, because he cannot disown himself. So here we see God's conditional love. John 15, 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Timothy chapter 2. God's love covenantally is totally conditional. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because do you have to believe in order to be saved? Well, everybody agrees on that. Are you saved if you don't believe? Of course not. You have to believe in order to be saved. So salvation is conditional. God's love is conditional. But how do we put this together? How do we put together God's unconditional love by election from eternity past with God's covenant love, which is totally conditional? Well, I think we put it together this way. That God has predestined before the creation of the world, unconditionally, that is, without regard to our faith or to our works. God has predestined, he's chosen before the creation of the world who would be holy and blameless in his sight. Or in other words, God has unconditionally chosen or set his love upon those who would meet the conditions of the covenant and remain in the love of God. That's how I think we put those two biblical realities together. So yes, God's love for us is unconditional. We just have to know what sense that unconditional love is, in what sense that love is unconditional. And yes, God's love is conditional. And we have to know in what sense God's love is conditional, that is, covenantally. But those God has loved before the creation of the world will remain in his covenant love, because they will persevere in faith and faithfulness to the very end.